Hi, I'm Leah and this is Filter Free Photography. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the Tamron 90mm f2.5 macro. So today I'm back looking at another lens which was around in the 80s and the early 90s, the Tamron 90mm f2.5 macro. There are a few different versions of this. This one is from about the early 90s, I believe. This one, they call it 52BB. You'll also see a 52B version out there that looks a little bit more retro and is, I believe, a little bit heavier. But aside from that, they're the same optical formula. So anything that I say about this one will apply to that. So this is part of the adaptall mounts from Tamron, which means at the time they had a kind of little lens adapter at the bottom. Rather than having a single mount, you could get their adaptall mount and whatever kind of camera you were using, like Olympus or Pentax or Canon, you could just use their adaptall and then put on one of their adaptall lenses onto it. So what that means is that you'll find this lens with a whole bunch of different mounts because it depends on what adaptall mount that person bought it with. This is a Pentax PK mount. You can remove the adaptall mount and switch it with a different one, but then you'd have to go and find the right adaptall mount. So this is one of the lenses that a lot of people on the internet talk about because it's a really good example of a vintage lens which still holds up to today. The first thing that you'll notice when you're looking at this lens is that it's quite heavy. It's quite well made as well. It feels very sturdy, but I was worried when I first got it that it would be a little bit heavy to carry around on my Sony a7 II or my 6000. It has 9 blades, which I really like because generally that means you're going to get kind of a smoother bokeh, and what I shoot is mostly portraits. So although this is a macro lens, it is 90mm and does go down to 2.5, so I thought it would work for portraits as well. And indeed, as I stop it down, you can see that it remains largely a round aperture at all stops. Now this is a macro lens, but it only is a macro 1:2 lens. They sold an optional adapter, which you can still find with it sometimes, that gives you a true 1:1 reproduction value for macro. So what that means is without that adapter, you're not going to get that really exotic macro that you can sometimes see, but it should still work pretty well. So not only is this lens quite heavy compared to how I thought it would be, given that it looked like it was mostly plastic, it's actually mostly metal, and when you put it onto an adapter for E-mount, it gets even larger. And if you're starting to focus on something very close for the macro mode, you'll see it gets even larger. So it's quite a large lens when you're focused all the way in. But one of the reasons that I like macro lenses as a portrait photographer is sometimes the macro lets you focus a little bit closer without getting into the real macro level. And that can let you get really nice blurred bokeh in the background that you can't get with something where you have to be 4 feet away to focus. So now I'm going to show you some photos that I took with this lens. I'll show you first the full-size photos, and for some of them I'll then have a zoomed in version at 100% magnification. All of these photos have just been adjusted for exposure slightly. Nothing else has been done to them, so no contrast or anything like that. Welcome back. So the first thing that I noticed about this lens is that it actually is quite sharp. And when I say quite sharp, I mean basically modern levels of sharpness. I think that it was reaching very close to the resolution power of my Sony sensor, which is really great to see from something that's from 1990 or before. So you can see in these photos that it's quite sharp, even wide open, and it's sharp in the center and also in the corners as well. So sharpness, if that's what you're looking for, is going to be really great with this lens. You do see a little bit of vignetting here in the corners when it's wide open, but that's not really anything to be concerned about. It's quite mild, and you can fix it in post if using Lightroom or Capture One or whatever. One immediate negative that I noticed is that when shooting wide open, even with a lens hood, you'll see there's this kind of blurry flare that's very common to see with vintage lenses, but there's not really much that you can do about it. So I'm not a really big fan of that flaring on bright surfaces, but luckily as soon as you stop it down, even half a stop, that pretty much disappears. Now, if you look at these photos, I was a little bit disappointed here that sometimes the bokeh, the blurred background, can be a little bit busy to my taste. It's a little bit harsh at certain different distances. Like if you look at the trees behind these people here who were looking at the bear from earlier, you'll see that it's a little busy. I don't really find it to be that kind of creamy look that I like. However, this is only true at certain distances. So when you get closer to that macro mode, or if you were taking a headshot of somebody, it actually does start to look a lot better as far as the quality of the blur. Now, as for the macro mode of this, I found that it worked quite well. So if you look at this flower pot, and then you can see sort of like that it's about half my height, so up to my waist maybe. And then as we get closer, this tiny flower, you can see the level that we can zoom into it using the macro capabilities of this lens. So for taking pictures of flowers or little birds or insects, this is quite good, but you won't be able to get super close enough to see like all the facets of a dragonfly's eye probably, but just enough so that it really is obviously still something that's macro. You know, overall, I do understand why this is a popular lens. It behaves very much like a vintage equivalent to a modern lens. There's a kind of almost sterile near perfection to it, which is a strange thing to say about a vintage lens. Usually I use vintage lenses because they add some kind of other character to the photo, and this just feels like I could use it for basically anything. It really was a pleasure to use. It moves fluidly. It's got quite a long focus throw, but that's what you'd expect from a macro lens. And you can use it in pretty much any situation, from portrait to macro to just a walk around lens. The only downside to it is that it is quite large and quite heavy, especially on some of our modern mirrorless cameras today. But one of the nice things about it is that it can be adapted to pretty much any camera that exists. So I wouldn't hesitate to use it on my film Pentax camera, or on something maybe that didn't need this adapter. So as with several of the reviews that I've done on this channel before, one of the nice things about this lens is that it is a cheap 90mm choice for vintage lenses. The lenses that are in the portrait range of maybe 70 to 100 millimeters are often quite pricey, and this is a really stellar lens in that range. You just have to be a little bit careful to not get that harsh bokeh, and you have to be willing to put up with a little bit of weight while you bring it around. But if you're somebody who wants to take photos of people as well as flowers, as well as a bird that you see, then this is going to cover pretty much all your bases. So that's really about it for this lens. There's not much more to say. It's really a stellar lens. I can see why it's popular. And I got mine for, I think, probably about $120 off of eBay. So it's quite cheap for what it is. If any of you have ever used this lens, please let me know in the comments what you think. And do please remember to like and subscribe. And I'll see you next time. Thank you.